Okay, we're delighted that John Fund has finally been able to join us after delays in flights, having been rerouted through Auckland, more delays in Auckland. So finally from the East Coast US to Los Angeles, through Auckland, through Sydney, John is finally here. Now, I'm not going to go through all of John's lengthy sort of publication record, the books that he's written, the fact that he works for National Review, The American Spectator, Fox News. He was a former opinion, one of the people on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. But there are two sort of things that I'll relate that I think are possibly more interesting. The first, which is rather relevant, is the fact that John Fund has known President Trump for the last 28 years, which I think gives him a particular insight into the US election. But the second one is that back when John was in high school, there was a weekly interview that he used to do with a certain person known as Ronald Reagan.
10 others.
So Ronald Reagan used to do the governor and the students press conference that Ronald Reagan would do on a regular basis. And one of the interesting things John used to say is that at the very, very last one of these, just as then Governor Reagan was leaving the governorship, John decided to use this opportunity to actually ask the tough questions. Well, you say this, but you've increased taxes, you've increased spending, and sort of started criticising President Reagan from the right. It sort of shows you where John's, from a young age, John's solid ideological views. But after this, John made the comment that after President Reagan defended him from everyone who started criticising his actions, then Governor Reagan sort of took him aside and sort of went through, if you want to do this is how you give a speech, this is what you need to do. And John says that whenever he gives a speech, he uses Ronald Reagan's method of speech writing that he was taught when he was a young high school student. So we are now going to hear a short talk by John Fund as instructed by Ronald Reagan.
I know it's exciting for me to be in Australia because I have not suffered from jet lag, despite having been on a plane or several planes for 24 hours. My luggage has not yet arrived, but I did pack in my cabin baggage my lucky Australian kangaroo tie, which I highly recommend. And it is a pleasure to be here. One of the lessons Ronald Reagan taught me is, if the introduction that your interlocutor gives you when you're about to be giving a speech gives rise to so many good questions, you change your speech. So I'm going to change my speech. Was told I had to talk for 18 minutes. I'm going to change that. I think this audience is going to be primed with their own questions, so I'll try to make my remarks short as long as you'll extend the Q&A. So I'll give you the secret to Reagan's speech writing ability. Before he was president, he wrote all of his own speeches. But they weren't really speeches, they were notes, and here's how he would do it. He would find, this is by the way all pre-internet and mostly even pre-computer, so you have to adjust it to today's technology. He would read something, he would find something, people would send him something, and in his own inimitable handwriting, he'd put it on a 3x5 index card. And then he'd color code them by subject. So yellow was for political courage or cowardice. You had a panel on that at the VIP lunch. Green was for financial issues. Red was for commies. And so everything had a color coding. And he would put a loose rubber band around them so they would all bind together by category. He had a special briefcase with pockets for all of these cards. So he's flying in to give a speech, let's say to Ducks Unlimited, which is one of our nature groups. And so he lays out on the tray table of the plane, he would lay out all of the cards by category. Then he would say, well, I'm speaking to an environmental group, I have to have an environmental joke or statement. And then, but my real mission is to talk about fiscal discipline, so I have to have a balanced budget thing here. And then, of course, we have to have an ending anecdote or soaring appeal to patriotism. And he would take these cards and put them in the proper order, put back a loose rubber band around them, and he would slip them in this coat pocket. And then he was introduced. So he goes up on the stage. He almost always stood behind a podium. And if you watch certain clips of Reagan on YouTube, you will see this before he became president. You would see him, acknowledging the crowd and all of this and nodding and smiling. And then the hand reaches out slips out the pack of cards, flicks off the rubber band, it's very thin, and he has the cards in front of him. Now, the cards were normally 70% old material that he had mastered and 30% new material focused on what the group's interests were. And the cards he didn't read from, but they were there to make sure he didn't lose his place, or if he lost his place, he could recover. So they were sort of a guardrails, so he wouldn't go off and meander. Now, the other thing that Reagan did, and to this day I don't know how he did it, he was an early wearer of hard contact lenses. And he wore his lenses 24 hours a day, except for sleeping, because he was so nearsighted. That's why he didn't fight in World War II. He was doing movies for patriotic purposes. Before the speech, he would take out one contact lens, put it in its case, so when he was facing the audience, he had one lens in and one lens out. With the lens in, he was able to look down at his notes when he had to keep his place. With the lens out, he would stare at the audience. Don't ask me how he did it, but somehow he was able to adjust his eyes and train them that way. And he used to joke later in his career, I gave hundreds and hundreds of speeches. I could never see my audience. They were all just a complete blur. But he could look down at his notes with crystal clarity and be able to keep his place. And to this day, I didn't bring any index cards today, but to this day I use that method, and it works. Now, my message is very Reagan-esque. A good friend of mine, Henry Olson, came to speak to the Menzies Institute and some other groups in Australia last year. He's coming out with a new book called The Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan, how Ronald Reagan was able to appeal across income, class, education lines to a wide range of Americans. He was a conservative, but his appeal transcended conservatism. And in fact, in Reagan's famous 1964 speech, and this is where it connects, I think, to Donald Trump's success in last year's election, he said, one of the great lines of politics, he said, "We are often told that we must make a false choice between right or left. I submit to you that those distinctions are an arbitrary one drawn from where certain parties sat in the French Revolutionary Assembly at the time of the French Revolution. Rather than having a contest between right and left, I believe politics is not horizontal, it's vertical. It's a contest between up to the maximum degree of freedom consistent with order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. How we position ourselves, how we argue for freedom, we should argue it on the up or down continuum, not a simplistic right or left spectrum." Now, Donald Trump is different than Ronald Reagan in so many ways. But Trump's ability to appeal across party lines, to appeal across traditional divisions, was very real in the 2016 election. Just give you a couple data points before I get to questions. Trump instinctively, and believe me, this did not come from reading. You could walk through Donald Trump's deepest interest in books and not get your ankles wet. Donald Trump instinctively understood that there was a forgotten man and a forgotten woman out in the heartland of America. People who've been left behind by globalization, people who felt their traditional values were under siege, political correctness was running amok. If somebody wants to ask me about political correctness, I have one of the great political correctness anecdotes. So Trump instinctively understood this person or persons were out there, and he appealed to them. Now, the British writer David Goodbart, who's a former left-wing editor, has written a new book in which he talks about how this phenomenon is in every Western democracy, including Australia. He calls it the dispute between the somewheres and the anywheres. And certainly with One Nation and Packer and various other populist movements in this country, you are familiar with this argument. What he says is, the modern global economy has created a highly educated, highly mobile, cosmopolitan elite that is very advantaged because of its educational and other skills, and it's about a quarter of the population now of most Western democracies. They call themselves, or they should be called, the anywheres, because their interests are everywhere. They travel, they're in international business, they often work for multi-global national companies. They are the ones who have benefited from globalization. Most of the people in this room, not all, but most, would fit into that broad category. About half the population are the somewheres. These are people who are not the great beneficiaries of globalization. And they are rooted in their place where they grew up and where they still traditionally live because they don't move as much as the anywheres. They're not as mobile. They don't always gravitate just to the big cities. And their belief is in patriotism, in the nation state, that it means something to be an Australian, it means something to be an American, it means something to be a person of faith, it means something to live in the same neighborhood for 30 years and help out your neighbors and be involved in local community associations. It means something to be rooted in something more important than yourself, your community, your beliefs, your ethnic attachments, depending on where your parents or grandparents may have come from. So, what Donald Trump instinctively knew was the anywheres dominate the media conversation. They dominate the financial conversation. They dominate the political conversation because of their campaign contributions. The media bubble, which ignored the Trump phenomenon, Politico magazine in the United States has just come out with a new survey using Labor Department statistics of where people work, what the job they do, what county they live in, to come up with the following astonishing two numbers. 90% of people who work in internet publishing and journalism in America live in counties carried by Hillary Clinton. Add in newspapers and television, which are more broadly distributed because obviously there has to be local audiences, it's 75%. So the media bubble is not just in existence, it's a media shroud. Completely impervious to outside ideas and challenges to the anywhere thinking, the anywhere consensus. Now, the people in this room would not agree with much of what the somewheres think or believe. I believe in free trade. I believe we certainly have to have an appreciation and understanding, which many people have not among the anywheres, of the dislocation that it can create. Some of the somewheres have very parochial attitudes, some of them even verging on xenophobia. I reject that. But we have to understand where it comes from, and partly it's rooted in the complete contempt with which all of their beliefs are held by the anywheres, or many of the anywheres. People do not like to be condescended to, and if they're condescended to enough, and political correctness smothers their normal inclinations to engage in free speech, they will rebel, and that's what happened in the United States of America with Donald Trump. That's what happened. Look at the states that he won that a Republican had not won in over 30 years. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Iowa. This was a remarkable feat. Donald Trump also lost a lot of highly educated Republicans who rebelled at his, well, how shall I characterize Donald Trump's attitude as a candidate? He's the only person I've ever met who is an extreme sufferer of both forms of attention deficit disorder. He has the children's form of deficit disorder, which is the child cannot pay attention, and he has the adult form of deficit disorder that the adult needs attention. He has both in the same person. Now, there are many Trump policies I favor, but having watched Donald Trump for 28 years, and I'll conclude on this point, here's my suggestion for you, watching from afar. Pay very little attention to what he says. Always watch what he does, because he is supremely tactical. After all, this is a man who was a prominent Democratic fundraiser and member of the Democratic Party as late as 2009. This is a man who has belonged to 5 political parties in the last 15 years. Now, he knows what brought him to the White House, and it was primarily conservative values and themes and anti-regulatory themes. So he is going to dance with the one who brung him as much more than anyone else. But if you wanted to know why there's this wandering, the only core that's there is Trump Inc. And of course, Trump Inc. continues to grow because now he's finally has a platform where he gets all the attention he's ever wanted. Thank you. I hope I left some time
For those of you wanting to submit questions for the app, I realise that due to the shift of time, there is no schedule at the moment. So if you can submit your questions in the original session, for this, so I can see a lot of people taking out their phones now. So hopefully I'll see a few more. So the original morning session that John was meant to speak at, if you could write your questions during that session. In the meantime, we'll take that.
Does John have an anecdote about political correctness?
Oh! See, one of Reagan's tricks on speeches was, if you're held to a certain number of minutes, you hint at what your question should be, so you can basically expand your time for speaking, because in theory you're responding to a question which you have planted publicly in the audience. So, thank you so much for picking up on that. In Nova Scotia, Canada, there's a doctor, professional who's worked in his community for 45 years. For 3 generations, you know, they have, do you have personalized license plates in Australia? Yeah. Okay, well, they have them in Canada too. For 3 generations, his family has had his family name on its license plate. And his name is Dr. David Grabher. That's his name. Well, he got a notice the other day from the DMV. I'm sorry, we're taking away your license plate after 57 years in the family. And the reason is, someone out there might be offended and thinking that they're driving behind some sexual assault maniac or somebody who's going to grab her. And he says, well, this is preposterous. Who's complained? I mean, I drive every day. Who's complained? Well, no one, but they might. We heard about the precautionary principle during the innovation panel. This is the precautionary speech principle. Just because someone thinks that someone might be offended, we now have to take away, frankly, what's a family tradition, an heirloom. No wonder people rebel when this kind of petty totalitarianism is enacted.
So the first question is from Taya, who asks, what is Trump a learning person who can get better on policy over time?
Define better. More in agreement with the questioner, I suspect. No. But that doesn't mean you won't get better results. First, 3 Donald Trump strengths. Has anyone seen the movie Rain Man? Yeah. Okay. Rain Man, there's a lot of things Rain Man can't do. There's a lot of things Rain Man will never do. There's a lot of things Rain Man will never read. But Rain Man is a genius in about 5 things. I mean, you know how he can do whole numbers to the nth degree. Donald Trump is Rain Man. There are about 5 things he does that are just genius. He can market, brand himself. He can use words of intimidation to target his opponents and ridicule them and diminish them. He can also be incredibly charming in private, far more than he is in public. And he also instinctively knows what the popular will is. So to the extent American conservatives or libertarians can make their ideas popular, he will respond. The last strength he has is this. Even though he is an egomaniac, he does know that he needs help. So when he reached out for his advisors and his cabinet officials, he did a far better job than I expected him to do. He hired people who are extremely conservative in many respects. I will tell you, several of the cabinet members came from Congress, so their rating scores for how they voted in Congress. The aggregate of Trump's cabinet is the most conservative cabinet that has ever served in modern American history. At least one member of his cabinet told me face to face, I'm so conservative, my right hand doesn't know what my extreme right hand is doing. So those are his strengths. The people around, this is unusual. Normally a president gets into office and his staff is always more liberal or collectivist than he is. Trump is the opposite. His staff is actually far more libertarian, far more conservative, far more anti-regulatory than he normally is. It doesn't mean that he favors regulation. It just means that he is a true populist. He responds to the popular will.
What can we see from a Trump administration that will be good for liberty?
Good for?
Liberty.
Well, let's look at the things that have happened already that are good. Some have happened that are less so. The nomination in our Supreme Court, unfortunately, has become a branch of government that no longer adjudicates laws, it makes laws. That's why it's become so much more politicized when the confirmation process for a vacancy takes place. The nomination of Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court was a home run in baseball terms. It was a perfect pitch. It was unbelievably important because a loss of that seat would have meant the Liberals would have won far more 5-4 decisions than the Conservatives. Now that has changed, and by the way, I think there will be a new vacancy on the Supreme Court this summer. I believe someone will be retiring. And if Donald Trump names that nominee, we know it'll come from a list of 20 people. It was 21, and then he nominated Gorsuch, who have been vetted by the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, and believe me, that list is a sterling list. The anti-regulatory agenda has been peerless. The president can only do so much through executive orders, but he has done a lot. His new health care plan, the first one was flawed. I think the second one will be less flawed. It's unclear if he can get it through Congress, but it's moving in the right direction. His tax reform proposal, which was just announced 3 days ago, is far better than I expected, far more supply side than I expected, far more oriented towards accelerating economic growth, which in the U.S. has been anemic. For the last 10 years, we've had 2% economic growth. Historically, we've had 3.6% economic growth. We're underperforming. This would turbocharge our economy.
We have two similar questions, so I'll combine them. From Michael, what are your thoughts on Ivanka and her husband being so close to Trump? And similarly, Julia asked, what's your view on Trump choosing Kushner as a foreign policy advisor, particularly considering he has no background?
Well, having met a lot of State Department officials who have a large background in foreign policy, that could be an improvement. You know the old British joke, we have a home office for the home interests and we have a foreign office for the foreign interests. Seriously, I don't think Jared Kushner is a major advisor to Donald Trump on foreign policy. I think he is his eyes and ears. I think he's a family member, by extension, whom he trusts. And if he wants to learn what's happening in a country and he doesn't want to rely just on the diplomats or the State Department conundrums, he will send him out. I don't have a problem with that. What do I think of Ivanka and Jared? Well, they are liberal Democrats. Most of the people that Trump has associated with over the years in New York have been liberal Democrats. The person you have to watch out for is Gary Cohn, who's the head of the National Economic Council. He's a longtime executive with Goldman Sachs. By the way, the one thing you have to wonder, you know, Democrats win elections, Republicans win elections, liberals win elections, labor wins elections, but it seems that Goldman Sachs always has people in the government no matter who wins. It's the most astonishing company I've ever seen.
Could you actually expand on that a little bit?
Well, look, companies are self-interested. They're allowed to be self-interested. Goldman Sachs survived the banking crisis in 2008 miraculously, but all of its competitors seemed to die. So I think their ability to weasel themselves into government positions and have people everywhere. I mean, the Treasury Secretary at the time of the banking collapse was Hank Paulson, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. So, look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do believe that people pursue their self-interest, and if they pursue it vigorously enough and with the skill that Goldman Sachs does, they have remarkable results. Now, I don't think Goldman Sachs is liberal. I don't think it's conservative. I think it's corporatist, if anything. But I certainly believe that it pursues its self-interest. And if it has ties to both political parties, and most countries in the world have two major political parties, it seems they always win. I mean, it's tails we win and heads are even better.
Two related questions. The first is, what does Trump genuinely believe in? And the second...
Trump. Next question.
Well, the second one, does he genuinely, the second one, which was from Eva, is does he genuinely believe his America First policies in the economy will actually make the US richer?
Maybe. He'll try them out until they don't seem to work publicly, and then he'll reverse himself. I mean, in the space of 24 hours last week, he had his minions put out the word he was repudiating NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada. And then he called Justin Trudeau by evening and the president of Mexico and said, oh, we're just going to renegotiate them. They're in place for now. This is a sine wave that's quite remarkable in governing terms. Does Donald Trump believe in anything? I've known Donald Trump or followed Donald Trump's career for 28 years, with the exception of protectionist belchings, which he has made consistently for the last 3 decades. There's no consistency to Donald Trump's positions. I think he has grown more conservative because he knows more conservatives. Spending time in New York until recently, I don't think he'd met many that actually were worthy of the name. The protectionist thing is probably real, but boy, can he change. I mean, at one point, he promised in his campaign, I will declare China a currency manipulator. And now he said, well, I just met with the Chinese president for 15 minutes. We discussed this issue, and they're not a currency manipulator. So even there, I wonder if there's that much consistency. Now, you may be horrified that a president has this much consistency. On the other hand, you can go to hell in a really big way with this guy real fast. You can also start reaching towards heaven real fast. I mean, the tax reform bill, 10 days before it was announced, it was much worse than it turned out to be. Then it turned out much better. And I just happen to know some of the conversations and some of the people who were involved in that. But it shows this president can be moved. He can be moved for ill, he can be moved for good. Again, watch what he does, pay less attention to what he says.
The next question is, what will happen to the Republicans in the near future? And secondly, what will happen, do you think, will Trump win a second term?
Depends if he's successful. He made lots of promises to people that the economy was going to be better, that we were going to be so tired of winning, we'd get tired of winning. We'd be so winning, we'd be tired of winning. The Republican Party has temporarily, I think, fallen in line with much of Trump's ideology, but Trump's ideology is so amorphous and unformed. I mean, you can basically say you're pro-Trump and still remain a traditional conservative Republican, and many Republican congressmen have been able to do that. They express concerns about his issues without endorsing his specific prescriptions of the moment or the day. There is a danger over time that the party, if Trump is really successful, that the Trump party becomes to resemble more Trump and less Reagan. That would, I think, be unfortunate. But Donald Trump brings real, genuine political assets and insights to this. The Republican Party had lost its way, especially lost its way with the forgotten man and the forgotten woman. This was an enormously important contribution Donald Trump made. And this book, when it comes out, which I'm sure will be available on Amazon, is really worth your read, how Reagan was able to bridge this. What Reagan's position was, I'm a conservative, but this is a coalition we're building. And to get to, this is in American terms, not in parliamentary terms, to get to a majority in America, we need 51% of our countrymen to vote for us. What Reagan said is, if you try to get 51% of a varied nation like the United States to agree on one thing, you're going to have to include a whole bunch of people you'd never want to invite home for dinner. It has to be a broad coalition. And what Reagan was able to do was unite conservatives, anti-communists, social conservatives, libertarians, and he didn't agree with everything any of those groups wanted, but enough that they all united behind him, and he did it with enough charm, and he did it with enough articulation of basic American principles that he built something which, for 20 years, gave the Republican Party a new lease on life.
We have time for one more question, and that is from Samson, and he asks for your assessment of Steve Bannon.
That's the one question I'm going to have to really struggle to give a short answer to. I know Steve Bannon very, very well. I was a good friend of Andrew Breitbart's, a very good friend. The night that Andrew Breitbart died, Steve Bannon was in New York. He called me over, we got drunk together, mourning the death of Andrew Breitbart. I will say that Steve took Breitbart.com in a different direction than Andrew Breitbart would have. Andrew Breitbart's position on Donald Trump was very clear that he was not a true conservative. I don't think that Breitbart.com would have become the kind of mouthpiece that it became for the Trump campaign under Andrew. Having said that, Steve Bannon is extremely smart, extremely principled. I disagree with him on some issues, but he passionately hates the left. He passionately hates political correctness. He has an extremely good view of the connection between faith and capitalism and the necessity that rampant capitalism not rooted in faith or an attachment to a community or capitalism that doesn't feel social obligations to the nation state where it's headquartered. He has an acute understanding of that, which I don't fully share, but had been lost, I think, both among conservatives and libertarians. So I think he's a genuine plus for the Trump administration. He sort of keeps the flame alive, and I wish him well. I know the people who are leaking about him and trying to basically claim that his position in the White House has diminished to nothingness. I know who those people are. Steve Bannon is not someone I always agree with, but I know the people who are fighting against him, and I agree with them far less. Thank you so much.